Joining us right now via phone call is Rachel Bovard. She's Senior Director of Policy, Conservative Partnership Institute at the Federalist Society. Good morning to you, Rachel.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Happy New Year to you. Praise God. Thanks for your time today. I wanted to get you on to talk about big tech and its overreach. We seem to be living in a state today where big tech has almost more power than governments do. What would you say to that?
I would wholeheartedly agree with that, and I would say I think that they actually have more power than a lot of governments. I mean, these are the world's biggest corporations, the biggest we've ever seen. Many of them are international corporations. They don't consider themselves American companies despite being based here. And many of them have more resources than governments themselves. And I think the ability to control discourse, to distort the flow of information, and thus, control people's opinions and how they gather news and how they vote, that's a power that is unprecedented in modern life. And that's what these companies have.
They're picking the winners and losers too, and I think the part of that problem is who gets to decide the standard.
Right, and that's the issue that I think is being most heatedly debated right now in Congress is this issue of content moderation. Who gets to decide what content is put up on these sites and what is taken down? And again, it's a factor of scale. If Google only filtered information for 30% of the world and not 90% of the world like they do now, this would kind of be a different conversation. But because of the scale of these companies, their thumb on that scale in determining, what stands and what goes really does have an outsized influence in shaping political careers, in shaping access to voters, and again, a whole host of downstream effects of controlling speech.
But part of the hypocrisy in this conversation about big tech, I think, is, well, look what big tech does in China versus America, or in Russia even versus America. Even Hollywood makes special versions of their films to release in those markets. Big tech routinely just does whatever China wants it to do. I mean, LinkedIn backed out of China not all that long ago, so I guess they're not up for it anymore. But at the same time, why such a difference between what they can do and get away with in China versus in America? America, it seems like we never push back at all.
They do take the American legal system for granted. I mean, the American system of innovation and laws allowed these companies to develop in the first place. They'll say this, that Section 230 and the laws around social media here in the United States allowed them to develop. But the difference between us and China is that they can make a lot more money in China just based on the sheer number of eyeballs that exist there. And those companies desperately want access to that market. And to your point, Facebook is not in China. Google is not in China, though keeps being busted trying to be in China. And, they were busted not long ago by their own employees building a censored search engine at the behest of the Chinese government. So they're not, dedicated free speech actors here. Let's be very clear. They want to make as much money as possible, and China is their access point.
Rachel, I'm thinking about the last election and how much censorship there was, in talking about the election. Some people suggest that we create new platforms as a countermeasure to censorship. Do you think that's a good idea, or should we reject that in principle?
So, conservatives have, I think, always felt this way that, we can use the market to our benefit. If we don't like Twitter, we can build our own Twitter. And I think that's always, had a powerful hold on us until what happened to Parler. And I think, if you remember, Parler was a very, very popular Twitter alternative. As soon as it cracked the mainstream, as soon as it actually became a legitimate threat to one of these incumbents, Apple, Google, and Amazon swiftly acted, within 48 hours of each other to snuff Parler out of existence. They killed the small business completely. And so my concern is that even if we build other platforms, they will not be allowed to succeed based on the state of the market today, and that is dominated by a few, massive oligopolic companies that need antitrust enforcement. So until we actually create a free market in tech, it's my belief that, a lot of alternatives are really just not going to survive because these firms are so dominant and so aggressive.
Let's talk about how we even got to this point. It seems to me that although there are some great exceptions, and I hope you'll mention them, to this rule that I'm about to state. It seems like right or left, conservative or liberal, whoever's in power at the time, big tech just grows, and they get more and more power and more reach. Why is that? How did we get to this point?
It really was only over the last decade that these firms, vaulted from big to just incredibly, massive and dominant. Especially under the Obama administration, interestingly, where you could have seen, robust antitrust enforcement against Google, and the decision was made not to. The FTC under Obama said, hey, we see some evidence here that, there might be malintent in the marketplace, but we're going to ignore it. And that's just allowed these firms to grow and grow and grow. And, they've become vital areas of commerce, which I think is also something people forget. We think about these platforms as speech platforms, but Google and Facebook in particular are access points to the free market for millions of small businesses around the world, and Amazon as well. Obviously that's its sole purpose. And so, it's not just they've come to dominate multiple avenues of how we exist in society, from speech to purchasing, products, to selling products, to gathering information. So their reach has just become so entangled with how we live that it's allowed them to just become companies that I personally believe are big enough to shape the contours of society, which usually is not, the calculus in American government. In self-government, we the people set the policy, not the major corporations, but we've almost reversed that calculus at this point.
Rachel, we have about a minute before we had to go to break, but I wanted to ask, there's a lot of people who would respond to this and say, that may be true and I don't like it, but, big tech makes life so much easier. I get one-day shipping with Amazon. I get the Google results that I want. So why should I really care?
So I think a lot of people feel that way, and these companies have brought tremendous services and efficiencies to our lives, but I think the question is at what cost, and at what point do you stop realizing what you're giving up for that service, and should your government, set the parameters for what the companies can do with, your data, right? We forget how much these companies harvest on us, and two, if they are general avenues of speech at this point, should there be more parameters around? Should elected politicians be cut off from the public square? Should you be censored for your viewpoint? All of these things are questions that arise out of innovation. And traditionally in this country, we have a great and robust system of innovation. But usually when it reaches a tipping point, we incorporate that innovation into our values and traditions. And I think that's the point we're at this debate.
Hold that thought. I want to throw in another consideration into this conversation, and then I want to get to kind of what we should do about this, or what can we do about this, and that's the financial institutions. We're seeing a day and an age where January 6th, remember the big January 6th event on the Capitol Hill? I mean, not right in your backyard. Well, Bank of America decided to give its bank records to its clients freely over to the federal government without even being subpoenaed for it. Then, of course, you got PayPal deciding winners and losers, who gets to have access to the ability to make transactions, and a bunch of other big financial institutions making decisions based on how you vote, what you put on social media, how do you invest? Do you invest in green energy or not, or that old dark oily stuff? I mean, we're seeing this in the financial institution, and it seems very similar to the stuff we're seeing in big tech. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's this, sort of cult of wokeness that just keeps, feeding into our different institutions. But I think, we've talked a little bit about why it's so dangerous in big tech, I think, to cut off, information and speech and access points to the market. But I think it's more even deadlier in the financial institution when you are literally cutting off the avenue of capitalism to people over ideology. And that is increasingly what we're seeing. You're seeing, sort of provocateurs like, Alex Jones and people like that being cut off from banking services. If you remember, after January 6th, President Trump's bank refused to work with him. 2 of his credit cards canceled him. People or his campaign, which used a credit card processing service called Shopify, wouldn't process transactions. So this is a level of punitive punishment by ripping away access points to capitalism, which is something we've never seen before, and I think a very dangerous era that we're living in. If people can just say, no, you can't participate in public life because we don't agree with you politically, I'm not sure self-government survives if that's the case.
Rachel, I know you probably don't have the solution to the problem, but we're seeing more and more. We're going towards the metaverse. Facebook has rebranded to Meta, and things are going to become more and more online. You're just speaking about the banking system, and who knows where this is going to be heading in the near future with all the electronic banking and having it more privatized rather than less. So what are our options, legally speaking? What can the legislator do? What can the executive do? What can the judicial branch do to try to curtail the powers of big tech?
Well, it's interesting with the judiciary, people have tried time and time again to sue these companies, to classify them into certain categories, and the judiciary has sort of thrown up its hands and said, look, the Congress hasn't spoken here, so there really isn't anything we can do. These companies are sort of legally inscrutable. So I think it's becoming more and more clear that Congress, the legislature, has to set the rules of the road. And what I mean by that is, they can put down a whole host of laws about what these companies can do with our data, which will curtail this massive expansion of power that a lot of these companies have. They can throw down laws, that govern speech, quite frankly, for elected officials. Should some of these companies be subject to common carrier requirements, like the telephone companies, and not able to cut off access points to speech for certain individuals? These are all things Congress is considering now. With the banking sector, you hear sort of conversations about decentralization through blockchain and things that would make transactions more anonymous. I'm not an expert in that, but that's what a lot of people throw out as a solution there. But at the end of the day, our self-government has to act at this point. These companies, again, as I said earlier, have sort of inverted the premise, and they are now directing how we live together and how we engage each other, and that's not their job. It's the job of Congress to decide how that should work, and I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, let's talk about Congress for a second, because we love the fiery, interactions between, senators and Mark Zuckerberg, and I mean, watching Zuckerberg squeal in his chair because he gets busted, realizing that he's been, collaborating with all these other platforms to censor folks. I mean, that's good, riveting television, but what's the bottom line? Nothing seems to change ever. What is possible here?
Yeah. No, I think we've moved past the point of hearings. We've been doing that for the last couple of years, and it's now time to legislate. And you're actually seeing proposals being put forward. The Senate Judiciary Committee is considering an antitrust proposal today. There's a number of Section 230 reform bills being put forward in the House, and there's a lot of pressure on, Republican majorities, if they take back the House or the Senate in this coming midterm cycle, to actively address this issue. And I think that pressure from the grassroots needs to continue, because this is something that actively needs to be done, whether it is, again, Section 230 reform, antitrust enforcement, which is something the law enforcement can do, but Congress is looking at updating those laws as well. All of these things, I think, would make a huge difference. Data privacy, interoperability, all of these things would go a long way. And again, allowing the good parts of these companies to remain while setting some of the more nefarious parts under the control of us, the people. And I think that's the goal of any legislative effort at this point.
Now, we're on 52 radio stations right now, live, praise be to God. And we're so grateful for the opportunity to be on radio, because we're able to say and do things, have conversations on radio that we're not allowed to have. We've received, I don't know how many channel strikes on our YouTube channel for having conversations that are not approved. What do you see? I want to throw radio in there. Do you see anything on the horizon that might be a risk to radio? Or do you see on the horizon the ability for radio, even though it may be waning in the face of the digital world, may continue to have a voice and an ability to speak out against these issues?
So I actually think radio is still incredibly powerful. If you look at the metrics, the radio is still still far and away a prime news source for how people engage the news. Where I do think there is a risk, though, is exactly what you pointed out, where radio interfaces with social media. That, I think, is, a direct hit on its ability to reach other people. And you're not alone, by the way. We were just talking about Congress a minute ago. Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin has been censored by YouTube, I think 6 or 7 times at this point. And this is a sitting United States senator.
Right. Yeah.
They aren't afraid of anyone. But I don't see any threats to radio as a means or a mechanism or broadcast mechanism down the road. Where I do see is the reach amplification being shut down, as you said, through social media, which does hamstring, I think, getting our message out. And you know that better than anyone. And so that, again, goes back to this debate of should these companies, be subject to some kind of common carrier requirements, that really restrict the type of speech that they can just shut off at will.
Do you see a major change if as we read in the headlines, that the midterm elections coming up are going to have drastic implications on Congress? Do you see anything changing in regards to that, if that's the case?
If Republicans take back the majorities, the pressure should absolutely be on them to address these companies. And I think that they understand. The more members of Congress I talk to, I think they understand this. You had a sitting president of the United States taken off of social media. And I think that was a crossing the Rubicon point for a lot of these members of Congress, as was what happened to Parler, which really shattered the myth that you can just build your own platform and you will be left alone, to be successful. That's not the case anymore. And so I do think that Republicans do feel pressure here. They have not yet come up with, I think, a coherent agenda to address this threat, and that's the next step. Because Democrats have their own ideas. Some are okay, and some are blatantly, looking to use social media for their own benefit.
Yeah.
So I think that, Republicans really need to develop a coherent agenda. And the pressure, again, if you care about this issue, this is something you should be talking to your member of Congress about repeatedly.
Well, I think as a parent, I'm the most concerned, about how my children will be impacted in the future, although I don't allow them to have connected devices or be on social media at this stage of their life. One day they'll be on their own 2 feet and they'll be their own persons, and they'll have to face these on their own. And I don't want them to have to face a world where everything is stacked against them and the game is rigged, and their minds will be, and their emotions will be manipulated by people whose agendas aren't in keeping with what I see as a Catholic worldview. As parents, do we have any recourse to a future like that?
So we haven't even touched on the issue of how bad social media is for children, and the companies know this. Facebook knows that Instagram, which it owns, does damage to the development of children's brains, has horrible impacts on the self-esteem of young girls, and yet, they advertise their product to young kids anyway. Mm-hmm. So one thing I think Republicans are considering that I think needs, in my personal belief, needs more steam, is this idea that parents should be able to directly sue these companies for damages.
Yes.
Right now, these companies are protected by federal law from any recourse for user-generated content. And I just, I think that a host of angry moms could get Instagram to change its policies faster than Congress, to be honest. But yes, it's not simply a matter anymore of keeping your kids off social media, which is a great first step, but this is ubiquitous. Google's in schools. They have access to the internet wherever they are. So it's not like, these are dangerous video games that you can just take away. This is ubiquitous technology that is everywhere, and I think needs a little bit more parameters.
I was listening to your panel discussion you had about 10 months ago or so, and a number of the people were talking about this issue, whether or not social media or the big tech platforms kill people, whether that's true or not. Now, of course, you said no in a qualified sense. So what do you mean by that, and could you expand upon your idea there?
You got about 60 seconds.
Well, I don't think that, the people at Facebook wake up every day and think my platform is going to murder some people.
Right.
I don't think there's intent there. But I do think that these platforms are wreaking havoc on our society. And, the way in which they've turned us toxic, they've turned us against each other. They have turned children's brains to mush in a lot of different ways. They've changed our brains as adults. And so I do think they do have a huge impact on mental health, how we engage society and sort of interpret information. And all of that, leads to an unhealthy lifestyle. So I do think, again, it's that we've reached that point where it's time to incorporate these companies into our values and traditions as a company, rather than simply leave them out there to dictate to us how to live.
Amen. Well, we are out of time. Praise be to God. Thank you, Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy, Conservative Partnership Institute at the Federalist Society, for your time today. We're very grateful to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
God bless you and have a great day. All